I work as a security guard on the night shift at a large hospital, and my job exposes me to all kinds of strange situations. My experiences can range from normal to moments that are harder to explain. I've gone many weeks without seeing or hearing anything unusual. But then there are periods when the activity around me intensifies, making everything feel much more intense. Lately, the activity seems to be happening more frequently and is becoming clearer and harder to ignore. I don't know if it's just something in my mind or if something is really happening. It could be nothing or it could be something. I guess it could go in any direction. My shift started like any other night. Over the weekend, there was a patient in the hospital, but she was discharged just after 6 in the evening. By 7, all the nurses had left, so I was the only one remaining in the building. At night, it's usually pretty quiet here. I'm also a college student, so I was at my desk doing some homework to pass the time. Then around 8:30, my phone rang. Normally when it rings, there's no one on the other end. The calls are always silent. But this time it was different. When I answered the phone, I heard static, but through the noise I could make out a woman's voice. I responded as I normally would, expecting the usual silence, but hearing a voice was unexpected and confused me. The voice was faint, but I could tell it was there. The woman said she was locked in the waiting room and couldn't get out. This sometimes happens with the cleaning staff, as when someone enters the waiting room, the doors automatically close behind them. There are 2 waiting rooms in the hospital. One where I usually work, which is near my desk, and another at the opposite end of the building. Worried, I grabbed my keys and hurried to release her, but when I got to the waiting room, it was empty, and there was no sign of her. I went back to my desk, sat down, and tried to focus on my schoolwork. I didn't think it was worth returning the call since I hadn't seen anyone, and it's hard not to notice someone in the waiting room. Then, about 30 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was the same voice as before, and she said she was still trapped in the waiting room. I felt a mix of concern and confusion, so I asked her exactly where she was. I wanted to understand why she hadn't left yet, and how she could still be locked in. She told me she was in the waiting room next to the parking lot, which is one of the 2 waiting rooms, so I checked again. But once more, I didn't see anyone. I turned around and looked at the security monitor for that room. The screen only showed a static image. Nothing was moving to activate the camera. Sure enough, about 15 to 20 minutes later, I received another phone call. This time, they asked why I hadn't let her out of the waiting room. She was speaking through the static, and the woman on the other end said she was just visiting her son. I'm not sure why I didn't think of it earlier, but we didn't have any patients after 6 in the evening. The only patient we had discharged was an older woman, and I realized that this woman didn't match that description. I felt a chill run down my spine thinking about what this could mean. Frustrated, I said, "Look, ma'am, I'm in one of the rooms and you're not in the other." After saying that, I heard a slight laugh, and then the line went silent. I looked at the phone for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I checked the call history and tried to return the calls, but all the numbers were inactive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was happening, and I couldn't understand who or what I was really talking to. I know there are apps that can clone phone numbers, so I don't rule out the possibility that this was a prank by someone trying to mess with me. I can't say whether what happened was paranormal or not, but if it was, it didn't resemble any of the entities I know. I'm skeptical and always try to consider other possibilities. Still, this situation will be added to the list of things I'm not entirely sure about. My dad is finishing his last days of treatment at a state hospital, so I went to visit him for Father's Day. He has been in a facility in Jamestown, North Dakota for several months. The building has a long history, which makes it somewhat interesting. During my visit, we started talking about spooky things and his experiences there. He shared some strange stories about things he has seen and heard while at the facility. The hospital opened in 1885 and became a place for people with mental illnesses and those who committed crimes. It was built to help those in need, but within just a few years, it faced a severe overcrowding problem. The number of patients kept increasing, so the hospital had to expand many times to accommodate everyone. But unfortunately, it still didn't have enough staff to adequately care for all the patients. By 1937, the situation became even more complicated. So the governor decided to fire the hospital superintendent, who was in charge of the facility, along with 75% of the staff. He replaced them with new people. Many of the new employees were chosen for their political donations rather than their experience. After the governor fired most of the staff, The new workers were not qualified to care for the patients and treated them very poorly. By 1949, the situation became public when newspapers reported on the overcrowding and neglect at the hospital. They highlighted the malnutrition issues, where many patients were not receiving enough food. In 1953, reforms began as the government and hospital officials recognized the need for changes. New policies were implemented to improve care, hire qualified staff, and ensure the safety and well-being of the patients. As a result, things at the hospital began to improve, and the patients received the care they needed. By 1974, the number of patients at the hospital had decreased from over 2,000 in the 1940s to around 600, and today there are approximately 200 patients. My dad liked to stay busy there, so he always took on different jobs, whether helping with activities for the patients, assisting the staff, or volunteering in various programs. From what I understand, the hospital was like an institution affiliated with his rehabilitation center, but people there were treated more like inmates, while he had more freedom and could leave whenever he wanted. He went to the part of the hospital that now acts as a prison and helped one of the ladies who works there with the laundry. They were folding many sheets and towels and then went downstairs for a moment to look for something. When they returned, they found the sheets scattered on the floor and all disheveled, which surprised them. It's important to note that everything in that area is kept locked, so no one could have entered to cause the mess. The lady who worked there told my dad it was Charlie, the ghost that supposedly haunts that part of the prison. The lady told my dad that they had names for different ghosts because there are many of them. They even have some rooms that they had to block because whenever a resident or inmate moved into those rooms, they refused to stay due to the number of spooky things that happened. Even the old warden's office was so haunted that they told the staff if they didn't find a new space for their things, he would quit his job and leave. My dad said that strange things happened there, like objects moving on their own and even flying off the shelves, which scared everyone. Since my dad could often leave the facility and had a job outside, he and a couple of guys decided to take a local gardening job. They were responsible for maintaining the grounds around the hospital and the nearby cemetery. One day, he was working with a small group of guys at high noon. The area of the hospital grounds where they were working was no longer used, but the nearby building had many windows, so everything inside could be seen. Then he and another guy saw someone walking inside the building, so they told their boss that there was another person working there too. My dad and the guy thought it was strange to see someone in a place that had been empty for years, but their boss laughed, joking about seeing a ghost and thinking it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. My dad is a serious person, but he and the other guy saw the figure clearly enough to notice his clothes and everything. The other guy asked my dad in a scared voice, "Did you see that?" My dad replied, "Someone is messing with us. That was a person." Then they saw the figure again. My dad said the same ghostly figure was walking quickly down the hallway toward them. They could still see him through the window, and the figure was slipping into the garage. He was wearing an old black and white suit with a matching hat and kept his head down, as if trying to hide his face from them. The guy who was with my dad ran away, saying he was tired of working there because he was too scared. But my dad yelled at him to run to the front so they could catch the person who was trying to scare them. They checked all possible doors, but absolutely no one was there. Somehow, the boss got the keys so they could investigate that part of the building. My dad said there was so much dust inside that they could see their footprints on the floor. There were no signs of the person they had seen. That guy must have been up to something shady because he was hiding from us and concealing his face. I work in sales in the healthcare sector, so I spend a lot of time in hospitals talking to doctors and nurses. My job involves explaining how our product works, answering their questions, and showing them how it can help their patients. I visit different departments and meet with various medical teams to ensure they understand everything about the product. Today, I had no planned product training or sales meetings, so I decided to visit a hospital I hadn't been to before. Located a few towns away from where I live, I thought it would be a good opportunity to introduce myself. I brought a box of coffee and some pastries for the doctors, nurses, and staff, hoping it would help break the ice and spark their interest in talking to me. My goal was to make a good impression and hopefully get them to schedule a meeting to discuss our product in more detail. I moved to a new place for this job, so I've been enjoying visiting different hospitals and getting to know my new state while working. I hadn't been in this area before, but the hospital stood out as soon as I saw it from a distance. The building was huge, with a modern design, and looked immaculate. The gardens around the hospital were well maintained. with neatly trimmed grass and flowers. The parking lot was completely full, showing how busy the place was. I was lucky and found a parking spot near the entrance. I got out of the car with the coffee and pastries and walked toward the main doors, but they were closed. I needed to be let in. This was pretty normal since the pandemic started. There was a sign asking me to state the name of the doctor or patient I was visiting when I pressed the doorbell. The sliding doors at the entrance opened, and I went inside. The lobby was empty, completely abandoned. There were old, worn-out wheelchairs scattered around, some overturned in strange positions. I didn't see any staff or visitors anywhere, making the place seem even more desolate. It was a huge hospital in a very busy city, but there wasn't a single person sitting in the waiting area. Additionally, the decor looked very old and didn't match the impressive exterior of the building at all. The waiting chairs had faded designs and looked like they hadn't been used in years. The carpet was dirty and stained, and the glass doors leading to the connected rooms were foggy and unclean. Feeling a bit surprised, I approached the reception desk, but there was no one there. It seemed like no one had been there in a long time. The entire desk where someone would normally sit was empty. There wasn't even a pen, computer, or a coffee mug in sight. It felt strange to see such an empty space in a hospital. There was a rotary phone on the desk. Yes, a real rotary phone. I'm 28 years old, and honestly, I think it was the first time I was supposed to use one. The phone had a layer of dust on the surface as if it hadn't been touched in a long time. There was a handwritten note stuck to it that said, "Dial 0 for the operator." The note looked old and worn, which added to the feeling that this place had been forgotten. I picked up the handset, but there was no busy signal. I hung up and tried again, but it was completely dead. By this point, I was really scared, but I was still determined to bring the coffee and my business cards to the right people. I turned around and saw that I was still completely alone in this place. There were no patients or staff in sight. I couldn't even hear distant voices or the usual sounds of a busy hospital. I left the coffee and pastries on the reception desk and started looking around, taking a glance down the adjacent hallway. The left side was completely dark, making it hard to see, and it seemed like the light bulb had burned out. I still didn't see anyone, no doctors, no patients, no nurses. It was at that moment that I started to feel a bit uncomfortable. The silence was growing louder, and the strange feeling I had upon entering was becoming more intense. The empty chairs in the waiting area only added more oddness to the situation. My job involves spending time in places like this, so I know how busy hospitals usually are. But this felt completely different, so I went back to the lobby and picked up the items I'd brought. Upon leaving, I counted 7 wheelchairs in the lobby, arranged as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. When I went back to the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief. The strange feeling disappeared, and I felt a bit disappointed that I couldn't meet my potential future clients. I drove around the building to see if there was another entrance I should have used, and maybe this one was under construction, but I didn't see anything different. The only other door was a back door that looked closed and unwelcoming. Frustrated, I decided to call my coworker, who had left the territory to me, to ask if he had ever been to this facility. I thought he might give me some advice or at least tell me if he had experienced anything strange there. He said he had been there several times before and that the waiting room was not at all like I had described it. 6 years ago, when I was about 14, I was walking along the narrow trails that wind through my parents' land. We had just moved to this area, and I used to explore frequently. The property had many old farm tools scattered around, some rusty, along with small wooden sheds hidden among the trees. These old buildings seemed to have been abandoned for years, with broken doors and vines growing over them. My parents had bought over 100 acres of land, which they still own today. The land was vast, with fields, trees, and some small streams running through it. It was a peaceful place, and I often enjoyed walking there in the afternoons. One day, while walking along a narrow path surrounded by thick bushes, a golden retriever suddenly came out of the bushes and stood in the path in front of me. It caught my attention because we didn't have a dog, and there were no neighbors for miles, about 5 miles away. The golden retriever stood still, staring at me intently. Then, it started barking loudly, but suddenly it stopped and remained motionless, still looking directly at me. The dog's eyes looked tense, and its body was stiff, as if it was upset or nervous about something. Its tail was no longer wagging, and I couldn't decipher what it wanted. Then a few moments later, a man about 19 or 20 years old came running out of the bushes and stopped when he saw me. He looked really confused and yelled. Then he started chasing me. I immediately ran as fast as I could back to my house and didn't plan to look back, but I could hear him yelling for me to wait. His voice sounded strangely familiar, which scared me even more. Eventually, in the middle of the forest, I could no longer hear his voice, and it didn't seem like he was following me. Still, I ran back to my house as fast as I could. Then I told my parents what had happened, and my stepdad went out to look for the guy for about an hour, but he didn't find any sign that anyone had been there. In fact, they punished me for it because my parents thought I was lying. Since they were very religious, they assumed it was just another wild story from their rebellious son. Now things are about to get really strange. About 5 weeks ago, I visited my parents' house with my girlfriend and her golden retriever, Bentley. The first few hours of the visit went well. I talked with my family, had some drinks, and enjoyed being home for a change instead of working my daily job. It felt good. Then I went out to let Bentley out and smoke. Suddenly, Bentley ran into the woods at full speed for no reason. I ran after him as fast as I could, but eventually lost his trail among the dense trees. About 5 minutes after I started walking in the woods, I heard Bentley barking at something. I ran toward the sound and found him no more than 15 feet from a boy playing in the forest. I looked at the boy, confused, and asked him, "Hey, what are you doing here?" As I started walking toward him, the boy ran away as fast as he could, darted between some bushes, and disappeared completely. I had never experienced anything like that before, and at that moment I had no idea, but the boy was wearing exactly the same clothes I wore when I was about 14. I told my girlfriend about this, and even she thinks I'm crazy, but it really happened, and I can't explain it.